What the hell is happening in Canada? Since January, a group of truckers calling themselves the Freedom Convoy has been protesting against vaccine mandates for crossing the Canadian-US border by blocking cross-border routes. There have been protests in a number of states, not just Ottawa, the capital. Being unable to cross the border is a big thing for truckers because it's about making a living. Now, you could argue that truckers aren't being denied the opportunity to make a living. All they have to do is to get the COVID jab. In fact, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has been reported as saying that 90% of truckers have been vaccinated. But what the protesters are objecting to, and I'm sympathetic to this, is the idea of not having the freedom to choose what they put in their own body. The irony is that vaccine mandates are being introduced by a Liberal government. When it comes to abortion, for example, social Liberals in general, and the Liberal Party of Canada in particular, is quite happy to support a woman's right to choose what she does to her own body. But when it comes to the COVID vaccine, the Liberal Party are quite happy to ignore body integrity. Whether the unvaccinated truckers are anti-vax or vaccine hesitant is besides the point. Take-up of the COVID vaccine is over 80% for 1 or 2 doses in Canada. A vaccine mandate is not going to change the minds of those who are anti-vax, and it's unlikely to persuade those who are vaccine hesitant that the vaccine is safe. In fact, it's more likely to make people think that the vaccine isn't safe if you try to force people. Now, to be fair to Canada, it's not the only country that has introduced vaccine mandates, and it's not the only country that has experienced protest as a result of them. However, it is surprisingly the country with the biggest protest against vaccine mandates, and it can now boast that it has exported Freedom Convoy to the world. As if vaccine mandates aren't illiberal enough, the Liberal Party of Canada has reacted to the protest even more illiberally. The Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has invoked the Emergencies Act for the first time in Canadian history. Its precursor, the War Measures Act, was used only 3 times: in World War I, World War II, and in 1970 with regard to a militant separatist movement in Quebec. So this is the piece of legislation that is now being used to deal with political protesters, peaceful protesters. I would strongly suggest that you look at videos by Lauren Southern, and particularly her live streaming videos of the Freedom Convoy protest, to get an idea of how peaceful these protests are. The truth is that the Emergencies Act is not needed. The recent ending of the blockade on the Ambassador Bridge in Ottawa, which carries 25% of US to Canada trade, was ended before the powers were invoked. The Emergencies Act is being used to freeze the bank accounts of people connected with the Freedom Convoy, to close the crowdfunding accounts of donors who supported the protests, and to threaten protesting truckers with the cancellation of insurance and the closure of business accounts. The fact that terrorist financing laws are being cited to force crowdfunding websites and payment providers to register with the government's Financial Intelligence Unit gives some insight as to what the Canadian government, a Liberal one, thinks of the protesters. So when it comes to dealing with a peaceful protest, the Emergencies Act seems a bit like overkill. Furthermore, Trudeau says that the Emergencies Act does not violate the Canadian Charter of Freedom and Rights. I'm not a Canadian or specialist in Canadian law, but a reading of the Charter does suggest that vaccine mandates and the invocation of the Emergencies Act does breach the Charter. Whilst the rights and freedoms under the Charter are subject to reasonable legal limits that can be shown to be justified in a free democratic country, as one would expect, it does also enshrine 4 fundamental freedoms: freedom of conscience and religion, freedom of thought, belief, opinion and expression, freedom of peaceful assembly, and freedom of association. Now, a fundamental freedom usually means one which can't be limited. It would seem that vaccine mandates would breach the fundamental freedoms of conscience and thought, and the Emergencies Act would breach the fundamental freedoms of peaceful assembly and association. I don't really know how this is going to end in Canada, whether the protests are just going to be disbanded, or whether it'll turn into something more. What do you think? Please leave a comment below, and please like this video if you found it interesting, and please subscribe to so you can see my future videos.